You're listening to What They Left Behind. I'm your host, Katie, professional genealogist, and I started this podcast to deep dive into the experiences of our ancestors and how they affect us today. As a genealogist, I discovered that there was a bit of a hole in podcasts that explored this part of genealogy. There's many that talk about research and applying to different societies, and that's wonderful and great. And those are good podcasts. But especially I'm seeing in my generation as a millennial, there is a desire for connection to our ancestors and understanding their culture and their experiences to better understand ourselves. So today I'm going to be talking to you about a topic that ended up being a lot more depressing than I initially thought. I'm not sure why I thought it wouldn't be depressing, considering we here in the US know it as the Irish potato famine. Now, that's a little bit of a misnomer, and I'm going to get into it, but yeah, not sure what I was expecting. Now, I wanted to cover this topic specifically because I'm recording this on St. Patrick's Day. And in the US, there are about 35 million Americans who identify as Irish or as having Irish heritage. And this is a significant number because there's only about 7 million on the island of Ireland itself. So, five times as many people in the US who identify as Irish. So, this is because of a mass immigration that took place in the mostly the 19th century. So between 1820 and 1930, about 4.5 million Irish arrived in America. So the reason that I want to talk about the Irish potato famine as we know it, and again, we'll get into that name, and about 2 million of those immigrated between 1845 and 1855 as a direct result of the lack of food that was caused by the potato blight and other factors. So, other than it being the reason that there are so many Irish in the US today, and my some of my own ancestors are Irish and immigrated during that time. What does this have to do with us, with the descendants of those who escaped this starvation? Well, in order to talk about what this has to do with us, the descendants of those who experienced this lack of food, we need to first understand a topic called epigenetics. And I'm going to do an episode on this a little bit deeper. So we're going to just like quickly dip into this today. It'll be a little teaser for a future episode. But epigenetics is when protein tags on your DNA can turn on or off certain characteristics that are basically meant to help you survive. If you think a little bit about when a parent goes through something extreme, they want or the genes want the offspring to have the best chance of surviving that. So the genes will basically turn on certain characteristics to make the offspring more likely to survive in that specific environment. So, as an example of what this might look like, we're going to take a look at an article that was put out by Purdue University about a Dutch famine in 1944 because of the Nazi blockade. Scientists found this an especially effective study group because the famine was short and complete, and they had control groups and were able to identify those who were conceived before, during, and after this famine. So, this period of starvation was called the, oh gosh, hunger winter? Hunger winter? And those who were conceived during this time, researchers found, and I'm going to quote here directly from the article, quote, researchers found that the famine had turned off certain genes in the children, and the genes were silent throughout their lives. The effects were dramatic. Children born during this period developed cardiovascular disease, obesity, and schizophrenia at higher levels. End quote. So, this lack of food basically changed how these children's bodies respond to the intake of food. So these increases in cardiovascular disease and obesity is their bodies trying to store extra calories because their genes are basically telling them that they need to be prepared for the trauma that their mothers experienced while they were in utero. The schizophrenia is actually a really interesting one, and I wonder if it is due to the amount of stress that the mother would have been under while she was pregnant. I am not a medical professional by any means, so that is me speculating wildly. But I do think that it's really interesting that we need to take into account that it's not just our parents or our grandparents' physical characteristics, like, eye color, height, hair color, nose shape, that we inherit from them. It is also the traumas that they went through that our genes really want us to be able to survive, so they make us more sensitive to those specific traumas. So, I think you probably can see where I'm going with this, but let's talk a little bit about the quote unquote Irish potato famine. So, in order to understand exactly what was happening during this period of mid to late 1840s, we need to understand the social structure at the time. So, in 1801, Ireland officially became part of the United Kingdom as part of the Act of Union. The Irish Parliament was completely abolished, and the Irish people no longer had any say over the laws that were enacted against them. As far as what day to day life looked like for the typical Irish person, we need to keep in mind that religion was a huge deal at this point in history. So the majority of Ireland was Catholic, and England was a Protestant nation. And obviously, this led to some conflict. In fact, the majority of landowners in Ireland were Protestant and usually English or sometimes Scottish. And many of those landowners actually were what were referred to as absentee landlords. So they weren't even also living on the land in Ireland. They weren't, many times they weren't in Ireland. Some of them were, but many of them were living in England and like benefiting from the value of this land that had been gifted to them by the English government. So, if you were Catholic living in Ireland, you were most likely renting your land from an English Protestant. What that meant was not necessarily that you were giving a sum of money, but that you were giving a certain amount of what you were growing or producing on your land. So if you were grazing cattle, you were those cattle would be shipped off or the milk would be shipped off to pay your rent on that land. So you really had to be careful about what you were growing, especially if you had a limited amount of land. You had to pay attention to what you were growing, how much space it would take up, what the value of that was. And then obviously you also had to make sure that you and your family were going to have enough to eat during the year. Now, let's get into the potato a little bit, right? So, a lot of people might initially think that a diet of solely potatoes would be pretty bad for you. But it turns out they're actually one of the few foods that you can live almost exclusively on and be nutritionally healthy. So many of the Irish actually lived off of potatoes and buttermilk, and they were well fed, and their population actually grew during this time when the potato was abundant and easy to grow and actually took up a lot less space in growing than other crops did. So you could feed a family of 6 on a single acre of potatoes for an entire year. And the same amount of grain, so like wheat, barley, oats, would take 3 times as much land to grow. So for those who had a limited amount of land and knew they were going to have to pay rent, they would grow the higher profit crops, and then take a small amount of land and grow potatoes for their family. And potatoes weren't worth very much, despite being a pretty well-rounded, nutritionally crop. So it made sense for them to be eating that for a multitude of reasons. It took less land to grow. It was reasonably nutritious. It was the cheapest of the crops that they were growing, and it was keeping their families alive. So, as somebody who did grow up in the US educational system, I think that there is this misconception of like, well, if the potato crop failed, why didn't they just eat something else, right? And we're going to get into that. So I think we're all pretty well aware that England by this time had become very good at colonizing. Starting out, at least, that's definitely what I would consider was going on in Ireland. They were trying to eliminate the Irish culture, the Irish language. Oliver Cromwell actually banned instruments because he thought that that would help, uh, I don't know, make the people feel worse and be easier to control them, I guess. And that's actually where we start to see lilting, which I am not going to try and demonstrate for you because I definitely can't, but look it up sometime. It's pretty cool. So the Irish at this point in history were being controlled by the English. And the English did not think well of them. And this was for maybe a couple of different reasons that they were observing. So, for one, the Irish were pretty good at farming. They were pretty good, especially at farming potatoes. They could plant them pretty quickly. They didn't take a ton of cultivation, so they had some free time. How dare they? How dare they have free time? So the other thing we have to keep in mind is because the Irish did not own the land that they were on, they didn't have any incentive to improve it. In fact, if they did improve it, many times they would then be kicked off of that land and the landowner would then rent it to someone who they could get more money out of because the land had now been improved. So there was actually a disincentive to improve the land. If you'd finished all of your chores, if you'd planted everything, if you'd made sure that your animals were fed, you had some time on your hands and it wasn't going to be spent making the land better. So it was spent doing things that the English perceived to be lazy. So that's partly where that stereotype comes from. And I think that that is an important thing to understand that and it's something that we see over and over again in this story that the negative characteristics that the English assign to the Irish are because of the oppression that the English is putting on the Irish. Just keep that in mind as we go forward. So, now that we have a little bit of an idea of what it looked like in Ireland in the 1840s, we're going to jump to August of 1845 when the blight starts to emerge in the potatoes. Now, this is a fungus that was actually seen in the Americas 2 years earlier and was likely brought to Europe by trading ships. So this fungus was seen all across Europe. It had previously been seen in the Americas, and we don't really hear about it anywhere else because, well, we'll get into it. According to William Trench, who was a land agent in County Kerry, this is what he observed when the blight was first discovered. Quote, I was startled by hearing a sudden and strange rumor that all the potato fields in the district were blighted, and that stench had arisen emanating from their decaying stalks. I immediately rode up to visit my crop and test the truth of this report. But I found it as luxuriant as ever, in full blossom, the stalks matted across each other with richness, and promising a splendid produce without any unpleasant smell whatever. On coming down the mountain, I rode into the lowland country, and there I found the report to be too true. The leaves of the potatoes on many fields I passed were quite withered, and a strange stench, such as I had never smelt before, but which became a well known feature in the blight for years after, filled the atmosphere adjoining each field of potatoes. The crop of all crops on which they depended for food had suddenly melted away, and no adequate arrangements had been made to meet this calamity, the extent of which was so sudden and so terrible that no one had appreciated it in time, and thus thousands perished almost without an effort to save themselves. So let's talk about the actual blight for a second here. It was a fungus by the name of Phytophthora infestans, and it spread pretty quickly due to the fact that it had been an especially wet summer, and it actually spread through the water. And also, the majority of the potatoes that were being grown in Ireland were a variety called the lumper, which was especially cheap and had an especially high yields. So this was great for families who didn't have a lot of money to ensure that they were able to feed their families, to get as much of a yield as possible. But it was really bad for ensuring that there wasn't going to be a complete crop failure, right? So the blight spread, and in October of 1845, the rumors of the crop failure reached the prime minister in England. And remember, this is the government that is ruling over Ireland at the time. So he, believe it or not, is not the worst person in this story, but this was his reaction to hearing that there might be a crop failure in Ireland. Quote, there is such a tendency to exaggeration and inaccuracy in Irish reports that delay in acting on them is always desirable. All right, dude. So this is Sir Robert Peel. Yes, the prime minister at the time that the Irish potato famine started was named Peel. Absolutely ridiculous. Who is writing this? Um, and yeah, like I said, he wasn't the worst person in this story, actually. So he sent off a few people to check and see what was actually going on with potato crop, and they came back and said in their report to him, quote, we can come to no other conclusion that one half of the actual potato crop of Ireland is either destroyed or remains in a state unfit for the food of man. We, moreover, feel it our duty to apprise you that we fear this to be a low estimate. So, within a month of him saying, the Irish like to exaggerate, he gets a report back saying, no, at least half of the crop is going to be lost to this blight or has been lost to this blight, which is, again, a huge deal when it is what the majority of the population are eating almost exclusively, right? So, as I said, Peel not the worst person in this story. So, in England at this time, there was something enacted called the Corn Laws. And this is a fairly common practice even today. The Corn Law prevented corn being imported from other countries in order to keep the cost of corn at a higher value so that English farmers were being paid well for their corn, right? They didn't want to ship in a bunch of cheap corn because that would flood the market and reduce the price, and then English farmers wouldn't be getting paid enough. Pretty basic economic principle, right? So, because of these corn laws, the English government was extremely opposed to aid, which for some reason was apparently going to be corn, from going to Ireland. So Prime Minister Peel actually went around Parliament and secretly ordered several large shipments of maize, or what was then known as Indian corn, to Ireland. And he did this for two reasons. He did keep it secret because he knew that someone would have a problem with it because it's politics, right? But also, maize wasn't being imported to England, so he was kind of using that as his, like, safety net, right? He was like, "This can't affect the price of corn because it's a different variety, it's not what we're nobody in England grows this." So, there were a couple of problems with this. Maize actually needs to be processed a pretty specific way in order for it to be eaten and not have consequences. And that involves grinding it, it involves soaking it, it involves cooking it a certain way. And there were actually only two mills in the entire country of Ireland that had the ability to process this especially tough corn. And once it was ground and people were able to get a hold of it, people didn't know how to cook it. So it made them very sick. Actually, if they didn't soak it long enough, it would be still too hard and, like, scrape their stomachs. Like, it was really bad. In addition to this, the maize also wasn't being given away. This wasn't like a government handout. It was being sold at 1 cent per pound in an attempt to keep the cost of food low in Ireland so that people would still be able to afford food. But of course, we know that those who were reliant on the potato crop didn't have any money. Everything else that they had grown had been sent off to pay their rent so they wouldn't be evicted. Because eviction was almost as much of a death sentence as not having any potatoes. The weather in Ireland is not kind, and going on November, December, like, it would not be unheard of to die of exposure. So people were really having to choose between, do I keep this food that I have grown for my rent and not starve? Or do I sell that and not die of exposure? Right? Not really a choice. But it also meant that the people who were living hand to mouth couldn't buy the maize. So it helped some people. It really wasn't a great solution, and it ended up really pissing off Parliament when they found out about it. It really Peel made an enemy of both parties by doing this. So, as I mentioned, there were other crops that were being grown in order to pay for rent. What was happening to those crops? According to the Chronicle and Munster Advisor in May of 1846, quote, Ireland must in return behold her best flour, her wheat, her bacon, her butter, her live cattle, all going to England day after day. She dare not ask the cause of this fatal discrepancy, the existence of famine in a country whose staple commodity is food. Food of the best and of the most exquisite quality. So this is where we get into talk about why this was not actually a famine. There are those who do refer to this as a genocide, and I don't think that that is completely inaccurate. There was enough food being grown in Ireland to prevent these deaths. But the English kind of just kept taking the food. There were riots at the docks where this food was being loaded onto ships to be sent to England. There were attacks on landlords who were insisting on rents being paid or evictions were being carried out. It was not a good time. And in June of 1846, Sir Robert Peel, the guy who sent the maize, stepped down as prime minister. He had made too many enemies in Parliament and was not able to effectively run things anymore. So this new government was run by John Russell, who was a member of the Whig Party, which was the Liberal Party at the time. And we're actually going to be talking about his Secretary of Finance, whose name was Charles Trevelyan. Trevelyan had a very just like not good take on economics, to be honest, in my opinion. It's very familiar. It's very capitalistic, very protect the free market. And in addition to this, he was extremely religious, and he actually believed that the potato blight was a punishment sent by God to punish the Irish people. That's rough, right? Like, just that's a bad take, dude. So here's a quote from him in December of 1846. Quote, "The great evil with which we have to contend is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the people." Not not a good dude. Now, I don't want this episode to be just all depressing, but do you want to take a minute just to like really hate on Charles Trevelyan, because it makes me feel a little bit better to talk about what a shitty guy he was. Um, Here's another quote from him. "We attach the highest public importance to the strict observance of our pledge not to send orders abroad which would come into competition with our merchants and upset all their calculations." It's basically there he's saying, well, I don't want to mess up the people with the money just to save some poor Irish people. And then in 1847, he says, "It is my opinion that too much has been done for the people. Under such treatment, the people have grown worse instead of better, and now we must try what independent exertion can do." Okay, so you can kind of understand why the people who had the means to were getting the hell out of Dodge. According to the Evening Mail in 1847, just to drive home the point that this was not a famine, but an engineered starvation of the Irish people that happened to coincide with a potato blight. It seems like it was taken advantage of. Anyway, quote, this is from the Evening Mail in 1847. Quote, "Enough has been gathered in the past harvest to feed double the number actually existing in Ireland for a period of 12 months. But this is only a fragment of the marvel. There were green crops enough to feed 4 million of human beings, and all this is exclusive of the stock of cattle, sheep, pigs, and poultry." So he's not even referring to the livestock that is being slaughtered to eat. He's just talking about the wheat, oats, barley, rye, beans, the crops that aren't potatoes. He's saying there's plenty of food here. If Ireland had not been occupied by the English and forced to export the majority of what they were growing, they would not have had this famine. In fact, the rest of Europe saw this blight, and sure, it affected them, but not like the Irish. So again, Not super surprising that those who had the means to were leaving, were immigrating. And again, like I said, about half of the immigration that we saw between 1820 and 1930 happened between 1845 and 1855. So in these really hard years, that was when these 2 million people left Ireland in an attempt to survive. And that was for those who could afford it, because one ticket to the US for one person was about 6 months' wages for the average Irishman. And these trips these trips were not easy ones. There's a diary entry by a David McCloy that describes his journey with his family to Canada. And I'll read it to you so you have more of an understanding of what your ancestors may have gone through in their own immigration from Ireland to North America. Quote, "We left Belfast on the 25th of May, 1847, in an immigrant ship called the Independence. Father, mother, and 7 of us children. I, the oldest, just 15 past. We had to take with us most of our food for the journey, the ship supplying dried biscuits called hardtack. 6 weeks and 3 days afterwards, we arrived at quarantine and were delayed for inspection. Considering the times, we had fair accommodations for the 600 passengers, but there were 7 deaths during the voyage. One of them, my brother Thomas, aged 3 years, who died with measles and was buried at sea. Our accommodations were worse afterwards in immigrant sheds and canal boats. My youngest brother, Andrew, died on the Ottawa River and was buried at the 5 Locks near Bytown. The boat on the Rideau Canal going from Bytown to Kingston was terribly overcrowded, and the men were forced to remain on deck all night without shelter. Although it was in the month of July, the nights were cold, and the rain fell heavily. Their clothes were literally soaked, and all their baggage was stored away out of reach. Father took a severe cold, which developed into congestion of the lungs, and when at last we reached Preston on the way to Seaforth, he was too sick to go on. As soon as it was known there that Father was a Freemason, that fraternity did everything possible to help us. Joseph Erb gave Mother a small house with necessary furnishings. The Freemasons sent a doctor and personally helped to look after Father and the rest of us. And when Father died, they buried him. We were left without father, husband, or money, but not without friends, for the Freemasons continued their kindness to us. And when my brother John, aged 6 years, died, they gave him a respectable burial too. It was only 3 months since we left Ireland, and father and my 3 brothers were dead. Mother was heartbroken and took brain fever, and we feared we would lose her too. Everything possible was done for her, and the rest of us by our newfound friends, the Pennsylvania Dutch, and she gradually recovered. Homes were found for my brother William, my sister Mary, and myself. Mother kept Alex, the youngest, with her, and Joseph Erb gave her the house free of rent and taxes for 8 years. That was rough, right? This family, 2 parents, 7 children, came to North America. And in that process, one of the parents, 3 of the children died, and the other 4 children were split up in in order to make sure that they were taken care of. People didn't leave Ireland because they thought that it would be a fun adventure. They left Ireland because they wanted to survive. And I just want you to keep that in mind as we finish out Irish Heritage Month and as you process the maybe hangover that you have from St. Patrick's Day. Your ancestors fought to live, and because they did, you are here. whether or not you would agree with their religious beliefs or their politics, their lives and their hardship and their surviving that hardship is why you're here. And for those of you who are listening who don't have any Irish heritage at all, I guarantee that your ancestors somewhere along the line went through a similar hardship, that they also fought to keep their families alive, that they also fought to keep themselves alive. And whether that fighting looked like actual fighting or leaving the homeland that they loved and was the only thing that they knew, their bravery is why you're here today. So just take a moment to think about that. It's a big thing. And I just hope that when we remember what the Irish endured at the hands of the English, we also remember that that power struggle is happening all over the world. And I just hope that as you remember your ancestors and their fight to overcome hardship, that no matter their politics or their religious beliefs, I think that they would have wanted someone to stand up for them. And in that same way, I think we honor them for standing up for those who are being taken advantage of by those in power. Thank you so much for listening to the first episode of What They Left Behind. This one was a little bit more serious than I intended it to be, but I think that it was a really important message, and it was the one that I researched for, so we're gonna go with it and hope that it's okay. If you want to find me on social media, I have not set up an account for the podcast yet. I haven't decided if I'm going to do that, but for now, you can find me at Not Forgotten Genealogy. That's on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook, or notforgottengenealogy.com or notforgottengenealogy@gmail.com. If you have any ideas for podcast topics, episode topics, or any stories that you would like to share, I'd love to hear from you. So go ahead and shoot me an email. And I'm just excited for where this project is going to take me. So thank you again so much for listening. And I will be starting out here, putting out episodes every other week. I'm hoping to go weekly once I kind of figure out what I'm doing a little bit better. But for now, we're going to do every other week. And I can't wait to see you for the next one. Bye.